As Lynn said, I'm here tonight to talk to you about a really, really significant environmental issue that's facing not only the people of Albany, but most of New York. And that's the massive increase in crude oil shipments through the state and through the Port of Albany. And I want to focus tonight really on just sort of giving you a little bit of the factual background that has led to this issue coming to the forefront, and then to talk a little bit about some of the legal aspects of the issue. By way of background, I'm an attorney with Earthjustice, and Earthjustice is a not-for-profit environmental law firm, and what we do is we're a national organization. We represent environmental groups and community groups all over the country on various environmental issues. So in this particular context, Earthjustice is helping to represent a coalition, a very broad coalition of both national and statewide environmental groups, as well as local community groups and Albany City Council members, and it's a really broad coalition of people who have come together over this issue. So what is it that we're talking about? We're talking about a very recent change in how crude oil is transported across the United States. Right now, the issue facing New York arises out of two particular areas of oil exploration. And one is the so-called Bakken fields, which are located in North Dakota. And the other arises in Western Canada, Alberta province, where tar sands oils are extracted from the earth. And these are two different types of oils, different types of crude oils that pose different types of environmental threats. And I'll talk about each of them separately, but just by way of background, they both are an issue for New York and for the Port of Albany in particular. So tonight I'm going to really concentrate on Global Companies. Global Companies is a Massachusetts-based corporation that has relatively recently gotten into the crude oil transportation business. And as part of that, they first came to Albany in 2007, and they bought the facility that now has their name on it from ExxonMobil. And as is the case with most of the facilities at the Port of Albany, including the former ExxonMobil facility, historically, those facilities were used to import and store oil products that were coming into Albany and were distributed then throughout the capital region. And these were products like home heating oil and gasoline, kerosene, propane, things that people use in their normal everyday lives. And the materials would come into the port, they'd be stored in the storage tanks that you see down at the port, and then they would be moved out, usually by truck, to be distributed throughout the region. Well, Global came in and purchased the ExxonMobil part of the facilities back in 2007, and in 2009, they decided to get into the crude oil business. And so they began to bring crude oil into their facility in Albany by rail. And this sort of coincided with the huge explosion in production in the Bakken fields in North Dakota, which this oil is being extracted by means of something that is probably familiar to you. It's called hydrofracking. So this caused a huge increase in the production in those fields, and with it came an increase in the amount of crude oil that was being transported to the East Coast via rail. And these rail carriers are massive freight trains that are composed of between anywhere from 80 to 120 rail cars, each carrying a load of crude oil. after this initial foray into the field of crude oil importation, it obviously proved to be a very lucrative endeavor for global companies. And so in 2011, they went to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, and requested permission to double the amount of crude oil going through their facility so that they would be authorized to 1.8 billion, with a B, billion gallons of crude oil through the Albany terminal on an annual basis. In making this application, the company told DEC in writing that this doubling of crude oil throughput would not increase rail traffic at all. And DEC bought that, hook, line, and sinker. Now, interestingly enough, when the company made its application, DEC started to implement their environmental justice policy, and that is a really, really important policy that was developed some years ago and put into place by DEC. And basically what the policy requires the department to do is that if there is an application for a project that may affect a community that meets certain criteria in terms of income and demographics, then it becomes what's called an environmental justice community, and there has to be a heightened level of participation and engagement with that community. And the reason for the policy is really pretty simple. It's that historically, communities of color and communities of low income have really been bearing the burden of environmentally impactful projects. And these communities have had to deal with solid waste transfer facilities and refineries and all sorts of heavy industrial activities taking place right next to them. And they therefore have to bear the brunt of the public health and environmental impacts of these facilities. So the EJ policy, environmental justice policy that DEC promulgated, said, when you have a community like this, we are going to require you, the applicant, to go out and engage with the community. You're going to have to prepare a written public participation plan to ensure that the community is engaged. And your application will not be considered complete until you have an approved public participation plan. And it's a key part of the whole process because historically, EJ communities have not been given notice of these types of projects, and they haven't had a voice in these projects and the review of these projects. So back in 2011, Global asked for this permission to double its crude oil throughput at the Albany terminal. DEC writes them a letter and says, we've identified an environmental justice community. You've got to go through our EJ process. What Global did in response is they wrote a letter to DEC and they said, we've looked at this and our project's not going to have any environmental impacts at all on this environmental justice community. And that was the end. DEC didn't pursue that. There was no public participation plan prepared as required by the EJ policy. There was no follow-up by DEC, and the community was completely ignored. DEC then issued what's called a negative declaration, because we have a law in New York State called the State Environmental Quality Review Act that requires that if a project may have a significant effect on the environment, then an environmental impact statement must be prepared for that project. DEC issued what's called a negative declaration for Global's proposal to double its throughput of crude oil at the Albany terminal, saying this isn't going to have any significant environmental impacts whatsoever, and therefore no environmental impact statement is required. So, in November of 2012, DEC issued the permit to Global, allowing it to double its crude oil throughput at the facility. on the grounds that it wasn't going to have any significant environmental impact. And of course, the community was not notified of this and had absolutely no participation or role in this entire review process. Well, lo and behold, despite the company's proclamation or prediction that this was not going to require any increase in train traffic, everyone saw very quickly that suddenly there are these long lines of black rail cars parked in those yards. There are long lines of black rail cars running along the tracks that bisect Interstate 787 right through the heart of downtown Albany, right near the waterfront. And people started to take notice and start to ask questions. What is all this activity? What's going on over here? Why are all of a sudden all these tank cars there? In the meantime, the people who live right next door to this facility also started asking questions. And one of the main areas where people live that is literally within feet of where these rail cars are stored is called the Ezra Prentice Homes. And that is a housing development that is owned and operated by the Albany Housing Authority. There's another set of homes, also part of the Albany Housing Authority, called Mount Hope. And residents in both these neighborhoods started to ask questions. They started to have some concerns about the odors that were emanating from this facility, about the noise that is constantly emanating from this facility. And you have to understand that this operation never stops. This is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, 365-day-a-year operation. It is non-stop. So around the time that people started asking these questions, Global comes in with another application, okay? Before I talk about this new application, I want to talk a little bit about what it is that's been coming into Albany. And it's this Bakken crude oil. And the reason it's significant is that Bakken crude oil is one of the most volatile substances in transport in the United States. And not only is it incredibly volatile and subject to exploding and catching fire, but it is transported in what are called 111 tank cars, which are notorious for being insufficient for and inappropriate for transporting this type of material. They are extremely thin, so they puncture very easily, and they are historically very susceptible to derailment, even at slow speeds. And what we have seen just in the last year have been a series of catastrophic accidents. And of course, the most notorious and the most disastrous one was up at Lac Mégantic up in Quebec, where an entire downtown of a town was utterly laid to waste and 47 people lost their lives. And then, by the way, all 6 companies that were involved in producing, transporting, and refining that oil all declared bankruptcy immediately afterwards. And so guess who was left footing the bill for the cleanup of that horrendous disaster? It was the taxpayers in Canada. So there have been a series of very horrific accidents, both in Canada and the United States, directly linked to the continuing transportation of this highly volatile fuel in tank cars that are simply not appropriate for this kind of transportation. The most recent application by Global is to install 7 gas-fired boilers at its facility here in Albany. And the reason they want to have these boilers in place is because they now want to bring in to Albany, in addition to the Bakken crude oil, they want to bring in a kind of heavy, viscous oil that needs to be heated in order to get it out of the tank cars and move it through the pipes into the storage tanks. And then it needs to be heated in the storage tanks so it can get through the pipes and onto the ships and barges that are going to take it down the Hudson River. And this heavy, viscous oil is tar sands oil. And tar sands oil is notorious for being one of the most environmentally destructive fuels on the planet because of the toxic wastes that are generated by the extraction process, where you're literally extracting oil from sand that is being dug out of the earth. These huge strip mines where this sand is removed and then it's processed, creating huge amounts of hazardous waste. And then the tar sands oil itself, when it's burned, is heavily polluting. It's a terrible fossil fuel. And if it spills, it is virtually impossible to clean up because it is heavy. It's like asphalt. So in Michigan, in the Kalamazoo River, there was a spill of tar sands oil about 4 years ago. They have still not been able to clean it up because it sank right to the bottom of the river because it's heavy, and it's very, very difficult to get out. They have spent millions of dollars in a fruitless effort so far to try to get that stuff out of the bottom of the river. So that's the wonderful new product that Global wants to bring into the city of Albany. Now, interestingly enough, the company will neither confirm nor deny that it wants to bring tar sands oil into Albany. And strangely enough, DEC has not required them to disclose exactly what they're going to be bringing into the city of Albany. But pretty much every expert who has been involved in this is convinced that this is exactly what's going to happen. And because it's the next big thing after Bakken crude, there's a lot of tar sands oil being produced in Alberta, and it needs to get to the East Coast refineries. And Global wants to be a part of that action. Now, this application was submitted to DEC. DEC, again, as with the previous application, informed Global this is going to affect an environmental justice area. And Global did exactly the same thing. They wrote a letter back to DEC and they said, well, there's no significant environmental impact on this community, and therefore we're done with our EJ analysis. And once again, DEC said, yep, sounds good to us, and then issued a negative declaration again. Well, this time, the public found out about it in time to do something about this, and this broad coalition of community members and people who live at Ezra Prentice and city council members and environmental groups of every stripe came together, and we sent a letter to DEC January 30th and said, number one, you've got to make Global actually comply with your environmental justice policy. And by the way, you have to comply with your own environmental justice policy as well. You've already identified this as an environmental justice community. Where's the public participation plan? And we also identified all the different ways in which this proposal may have a significant effect on the environment and therefore should be the subject of an environmental impact statement. Well, we did get a response from DEC. They did turn around and require Global to prepare a public participation plan. However, we had said in our letter, since your policy says you don't have a complete application until you have an approved public participation plan, we want you to withdraw the notice of complete application until they have an acceptable public participation plan. Well, DEC still hasn't done that. They don't want to withdraw the notice of complete application. And the company still has not produced an acceptable public participation plan. So, after the huge outcry, and there started to become a lot of media attention to this proposal, DEC held a public meeting in early February at the Geffen Elementary School down in the South End. And Geffen Elementary School is itself well within the zone of danger from the Global operations. It's just a few blocks away, and if there were to be a fire or explosion or some kind of accident, that school would be affected. And so that was one of the points that we made at the public meeting was, think about all the children who go to this school What's going to happen to them if something goes wrong at that facility? And you know, the response has been, oh, well, we have these spill prevention plans, and we have these response plans, and we work with the Coast Guard, and we work with the fire department. And that's all very good, but that's always sort of after the fact. After the catastrophe happens, and you know you have to go there with foam, or you have to go there with containment booms. That doesn't help the people who have been incinerated, or whose homes have been destroyed, or whose businesses have been destroyed. It's sort of, you know, a day late and a dollar short. And what people have been asking for is some sort of assessment of what is the risk that is posed by these operations, both by the ongoing massive shipments of the explosive Bakken crude oil, but also what's going to happen with the tar sands oil, and what is the effect of starting to heat this stuff. Because when you heat it, it releases what are called volatile organic compounds, which include benzene, which is a known human carcinogen, and hydrogen sulfide, which is extremely toxic to humans. So none of these effects have been evaluated by the DEC, and that's what we're fighting to try to get them to do. So right now, the current status of all this is that the DEC extended the public comment period on Global's application until April 2nd, which is coming up very quickly. They have, again, you know, asked the company to prepare an enhanced public participation plan, but as of today, there is not an acceptable one in place. The company hired BN Communications to shepherd this through, and you may recognize them as the company that did the wonderful GE anti-dredging public relations campaign with the billboards and the commercials and everything else. So they're involved in this too. Now, you probably heard about what happened with the City Planning Board, and I know there's been a lot of confusion about that, so I just wanted to sort of help try to clear that up a little bit. In order to, a part of the Global's initial application was that they wanted to build a new building on their facility in order to house these 7 new boilers that they want to put in. And in order to do that, they needed to get site plan approval from the City of Albany Planning Board. And it became very clear to the company and to everyone else that the planning board, which was planning to meet tonight, and is meeting tonight, but originally they were going to meet tonight partly on Global's application, and they were going to issue a positive declaration requiring an environmental impact statement because they had, because of site plan review, they had separate approval authority over the project, and therefore had separate authority to require an environmental impact statement. Well, Global saw the writing on the wall, scrambled, redesigned their project so that they won't have to build a new building, instead are proposing now to house these boilers in an existing building on the Port of Albany property. So they were then able to withdraw their application from the City Planning Board and therefore pull the rug out from under the City Planning Board in terms of them requiring an EIS. So it was quite a clever move on their part. Whether it will actually ultimately help them avoid preparing an EIS remains to be seen. The other development that I'm sure you've heard of is the Albany County Executive Dan McCoy and the County Health Department issued a moratorium prohibiting the expansion of Global's operations pending the completion of a public health study. Global responded through its lawyers, basically threatening to sue and claiming that the county's action was illegal and violated their rights. And I thought, I don't know if any of you have read the letter from the lawyers, but it starts off by complaining about how Global wasn't consulted. It was the height of irony. So the coalition of groups who have been involved in this, we are absolutely committed to suing DEC if they do not withdraw this negative declaration. And we initially were planning on filing a lawsuit this Friday because we were concerned that there was a statute of limitations that was running, and that if we didn't file by Friday, we would be out of the box. What happened was we entered into what's called a tolling and standstill agreement with DEC and Global, which tolls the statute, keeps it from continuing to run at least until June 3rd. So the benefit to us of that was we needed the extra time to put together the lawsuit because we have a number of expert witnesses who are going to be helping us out, and to get all their stuff together and get it into a form that can be submitted to court, everything needs a lot of time and effort and work. So we needed the extra time. But in the meantime, we're continuing to lobby DEC. We are going to be submitting additional comments before the April 2nd comment deadline. Again, giving them additional information and reasons why this is a significant environmental project. And one of the facts that we're going to put in front of the department is that Global has just submitted an application to do exactly the same thing at its terminal down in New Windsor, which is just outside of Newport. So one of the things that we are really concerned about is that Global is really basically turning the Hudson River Valley into a virtual Keystone XL pipeline. That this area is going to become the tar sands transportation corridor for most of the United States. And the idea that the state's environmental agency is willing to turn away from that and not require an environmental impact statement is quite troubling. So we would hope that everyone here will contribute their comments to DEC, urging the department to require an EIS and do what should be done and look at all the impacts.